I've been working nights for the Sheriff's Department in Bergen County for the past 2 years. It's a quiet area, not much happens, most nights are uneventful. Sure, we get the occasional drug bust, maybe a robbery or assault call, but nothing that ever felt too out of the ordinary. That's why, when the dispatcher radioed in a disturbance call about a scream coming from a house nearby, I wasn't too alarmed. I figured it was probably just a domestic dispute or a couple of drunks getting rowdy. When I pulled up to the house, though, something felt off. The entire place was dark, not a single light on. I even had to double-check the address to make sure I was at the right place. There was a blue Toyota Sienna parked in the driveway, so I knew someone had to be home. Still, I knocked on the door a few times. Nothing. That's when the neighbor, the one who made the call, came over. He looked rattled, telling me he'd heard a blood-curdling scream from the house. He mentioned the woman who lived there was usually alone, but sometimes her boyfriend stayed over. The locked door and the neighbor's uneasy tone didn't sit right with me. I circled the house, checking every window. They were all locked, except one in the back. It was wide open, almost like someone had climbed in. My stomach sank. Something was definitely wrong. I radioed for backup before slipping through the open window. Something deep in my gut screamed that this wasn't right, but I couldn't just stand there. The house was eerily quiet, like it was holding its breath. I flicked on every light I passed, trying to shake the unsettling feeling that I wasn't alone. The kitchen and living room were empty. No signs of a struggle, no movement, just silence. I called out, loud enough that anyone inside would know I was there. "Sheriff's Department, if anyone's in here, make yourself known." But all I got in return was more silence. With the first floor cleared, I realized I had no choice but to check upstairs. I hated the idea, especially since backup hadn't arrived yet, but if someone was hurt, waiting wasn't an option. I unlocked the front door to make it easier for backup when they got there, then slowly made my way up the staircase. The carpeted steps muffled my footsteps, making the house feel even more oppressive. There were 4 doors lining the hallway. As I reached the top, I froze. A faint creak came from behind the last door on the left. I flicked on the hallway light and called out again. "Police. Is anyone in there?" Nothing. But the noise had definitely come from behind that door. I walked slowly toward it, hand hovering over my holster, and pushed the door open. Inside, the air felt heavier, like something was wrong. It was a bedroom, dark except for the dim light spilling in from the hallway. In the bed, I saw a figure under the covers. A woman. She wasn't moving. I called out softly, moving closer. As I got nearer, my eyes locked onto something dark, soaking through the sheets on the other side of the bed. Blood. My heart raced as I yanked the covers back, revealing the woman's body. She had been stabbed multiple times, her skin pale from blood loss, but she was still breathing. Barely. Panic surged through me as I grabbed my radio and called for an ambulance and immediate backup, reporting a stabbing. But as I stood there, something hit me like a brick. If she was in this condition, then what the hell made that creaking sound? My eyes darted around the room, scanning every shadow, every corner. There was someone else here. Instinctively, I thought of the closet. My heart pounded in my ears as I crept toward it, gun drawn, every nerve on edge. I yanked the door open, bracing for what I might find. But it was empty. Just coats and shoes. Relief barely had time to settle before that unsettling feeling crept back in. Something wasn't right. I turned back towards the bed, my eyes scanning the room, trying to figure it out. Then it hit me. The bed. I crouched down, lifted the bed skirt, and there, staring back at me, was a man. He was squeezed into the tight space. His eyes wide, unblinking, and a mask covered the lower half of his face. For a second, time froze. My blood went cold as we locked eyes. Every muscle in my body tensed as I shouted, "Show me your hands!" Slowly, almost lazily, he raised his hands, careful not to make any sudden movements. I wasn't about to take any chances. My mind raced, knowing I couldn't cuff him alone, not without knowing if he had a weapon. Keeping my gun trained on him, I barked out orders, making him crawl out from under the bed and stand in the corner with his hands raised. He did exactly as I said, all while keeping that eerie, calm look on his face. Backup arrived moments later, rushing upstairs. Only then did I holster my gun and slap the cuffs on him. As I dragged him out, I couldn't help but glance back at the bed. The woman, bleeding out just feet away from the monster who had tried to kill her, was still fighting for her life. Later, I found out the full story. The man was her boyfriend, and when he found out she had cheated on him, something inside him snapped. He broke into her house, filled with rage, and stabbed her 6 times. He must have thought he'd killed her, because instead of running, he hid, waiting for God knows what. The woman survived, though. Barely, but she made it. 6 stab wounds, and she lived to tell the tale. I should have felt relief, but I couldn't shake the image of his eyes under that bed. Cold, unfeeling. That's the part I'll never forget. In that moment, I was face to face with the monster who nearly took her life. It was just another quiet night for Mike, my best friend's uncle. He was out on patrol, working the night shift as a police officer with his partner Steve. The two of them had seen a lot during their years on the force. And after serving together in the Army, there wasn't much that could shake them. When the call came in from a landlord about a troublesome tenant, they didn't think much of it. It sounded like just another welfare check, something they'd handled more times than they could count. But when they arrived at the apartment complex, something felt wrong. It was late, probably around 1 or 2 in the morning, and instead of a quiet, sleepy building, they found all the residents outside. The entire complex was gathered in the grass, murmuring in low voices. Their eyes followed Mike and Steve as they pulled up, some glancing nervously toward the building as if they were expecting something bad to happen. The landlord approached them, practically fuming. He started ranting right away about one of his tenants, a man in his 30s named Adam. He'd been acting strange lately, the landlord said, and tonight he'd gone over the edge. Adam had turned on all the water in his apartment, sinks, showers, everything. As Mike and Steve walked toward the building, they saw the damage, did it for themselves. Water was seeping out from beneath Adam's door, spilling down the stairs and soaking into the carpet. The amount of water meant one thing. It had been running for hours, maybe longer. Something was seriously wrong. Mike and Steve made their way up to Adam's apartment, the sound of water splashing beneath their boots as they pounded on the door. "Adam!" Mike called out, his fist hitting the door harder with each knock. "This is the police. Open up." Silence. After a few moments, the two exchanged a glance. Steve nodded, and without hesitation they forced the door open. As it swung inward, a wave of damp air hit them, and they stepped into a surreal scene. Every faucet in the apartment was running full blast. Sinks, the shower, even the toilet. Water cascaded down from every corner, pooling in the already flooded rooms. A garden hose snaked through an open window, gushing water as if someone had rigged it to add to the chaos. But what caught their attention most wasn't the flooding. It was Adam. He stood motionless in the kitchen, his back to them, trembling violently. His clothes were soaked, clinging to his frame, and his eyes, wide and unblinking, stared ahead as if he was seeing something they couldn't. "Adam?" Mike approached cautiously, his voice soft but firm. "Are you all right? What's going on here?" No response. Mike took another step forward, carefully navigating through the puddles on the floor. Adam continued to shake, his breath coming out in short, ragged gasps. "Adam, talk to me. What's wrong?" At first, it was just a whisper, barely audible over the roar of the running water. "There are people in the walls." "What was that?" Mike asked, moving closer. "There are people in the walls," Adam repeated, his voice a bit louder, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. The words came out faster now, more frantic. "There are people in the walls. They're in the walls. They're in the walls." His voice grew louder with each repetition until he was practically screaming. Mike stepped back, startled by the sudden outburst. "Adam, calm down." Meanwhile, Steve, who had moved further into the apartment to turn off the water, stepped into the bedroom. He twisted the knobs on the faucet, silencing the gushing stream. But something else caught his eye. Along one of the walls was a faint line, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there. A thin outline, like the shape of a door that wasn't supposed to be. Steve's stomach twisted with unease as Adam's shouts echoed from the kitchen. "They're in the walls!" His gut told him something was very wrong. The line across the wall wasn't just some imperfection. The more Steve stared at it, the more it became clear. It was a hidden door, carved into the wall itself. His hand instinctively moved to his gun. Whatever was behind that door, he knew, wasn't going to be good. Mike was about to lead Adam out of the waterlogged apartment when he heard Steve call his name, urgency in his voice. "Mike, you need to see this." Mike turned back, his grip still firm on Adam, and rushed into the bedroom. Steve stood with his gun drawn, aiming at the faint outline he'd found in the wall. Mike's eyes followed Steve's line of sight, his stomach sinking when he realized what he was looking at. It wasn't just a crack or a damaged part of the wall. It was a door, thin, hidden, but unmistakably there. Together, they approached the strange outline. Steve reached out, his hand steady despite the tension in the air, and with a quick yank, he pulled at the concealed door. The wall gave way, revealing a small, cramped space no larger than a closet. Inside, huddled together, were 3 people. Mike's breath caught in his throat. Their faces were painted with eerie patterns, crude symbols smeared across their skin in dark reds and blacks. They stared back at him with wide, unblinking eyes, pressed so tightly together in the narrow space that it was a wonder they could even breathe. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the sound of water dripping from the ceiling. "Step out, hands where we can see them." Mike's voice was firm, but there was an edge of disbelief in it. The 3 figures slowly obeyed, crawling out of their hiding place one by one. As they emerged, Mike and Steve wasted no time handcuffing them, the strange, painted faces never breaking their blank stares. Backup arrived just as the last of the intruders was let out of the apartment. Other officers came in and gently escorted Adam away, still trembling and muttering to himself, too overwhelmed by fear to comprehend what had just happened. Later, it all began to make sense. The 3 people had been part of a cult that lived deep in the woods, operating on the fringes of society. They preyed on vulnerable people, targeting Adam because of his mental instability. They had been hiding in his walls for days, maybe even longer, tormenting him from within his own home, whispering, scratching, and doing whatever they could to drive him to the edge. In a desperate attempt to get them out, Adam had turned on all the water, hoping to flood them out of his life. For Mike and Steve, it was the most disturbing case they'd ever encountered. Even after the cult members were arrested and Adam was taken to a hospital for treatment, the memory of that night lingered. The image of those 3 faces staring back at them from inside the wall stayed burned into their minds. A year has passed, but whenever Mike talks about it, there's a haunted look in his eyes. "You see a lot on this job," he once told me. But finding people in the walls, hiding like that, waiting, I'll never forget it. It was just another long 12-hour overnight shift, the kind that felt like it would never end. I was trying to keep myself awake when the call came in. "Suspicious person." The voice on the radio was calm, but the details weren't. A middle-aged woman, disheveled with wiry hair, was going house to house, yelling at people to open their doors. The caller said she was mumbling to herself, acting erratic, and holding something behind her back. When I pulled up to the address, the man who called was visibly shaken. He led me inside to show me his doorbell camera footage, and I'll never forget what I saw. The woman walked up to his door, slowly, staring into the camera like she knew someone was watching. She didn't move for minutes, just staring. Then, without warning, she pressed the button and leaned in close. "Open the door," she said, her voice raspy and unsettling. "I need blood." Each time she spoke, she would laugh, this chilling, unhinged laugh, and pound on the door like she was trying to break it down.
The man's voice came through the speaker, telling her to leave or he'd call the police, but that just seemed to make her angrier. She tried to rip the doorbell camera from the wall, clawing at it before stepping back. The camera caught her backing away slowly, still facing the house, still watching. She never turned her back, just crept towards the next house, like some kind of predator. That was when the man finally called 911, and when I realized this wasn't just another call. It was something much worse. The search for the woman had escalated quickly. There were several units patrolling the streets now, but every minute that passed without finding her made my gut tighten. She hadn't just disappeared. She was out there, lurking, waiting. It didn't take long before another call came in. This time, it was a breaking and entering. The voice on the other end of the 911 call was shaking, barely holding it together. A woman had forced her way into their house, and the homeowner was hiding upstairs, too terrified to even breathe, let alone check if the intruder was still inside. I arrived at the house at the same time as another officer. We exchanged quick glances, both of us tense and ready for anything. Guns drawn, we entered through the unlocked front door, and were greeted by an eerie silence. It was the kind of silence that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. The caller hadn't heard the woman leave, and that only meant one thing. She was still inside. We moved carefully up the stairs, every step creaking under our weight. As we reached the top, a door down the hallway cracked open, and a pair of wide, panicked eyes met ours. It was the homeowner. His wife was crouched beside him, both of them too scared to move from the bedroom they'd locked themselves in. He whispered that the woman had been banging on their door, scratching at it like an animal just moments ago. They hadn't heard her go back downstairs, and I could feel the dread settling in. She was here, somewhere. We began clearing the rooms, one by one, sweeping through the shadows with our flashlights, cutting through the dark. And then, from the last room at the end of the hall, we heard it. A low, guttural cackle. My blood turned to ice. I pushed the door open slowly, flicking on the light, and there she was, sitting on the bed, grinning at me like she'd been expecting us. Her hair hung in matted clumps around her face, and in her hand was a large, blood-soaked knife. The sheets beneath her were stained red, and it didn't take long to realize it was her own blood. She'd slashed her wrist, deep enough to cause concern, but not deep enough to end it. Between her legs was a small doll, the kind a little girl might carry around. Only now it was covered in blood, her blood, and she held it close as she whispered to herself, "I need blood. I need blood," she repeated, her voice a hoarse whisper, punctuated by fits of hysterical laughter. There was something deeply wrong with her, something beyond comprehension. My partner and I exchanged a quick look. We knew this wasn't going to end peacefully, but we still had to try. Every instinct screamed that we were trapped in a nightmare, and the real horror was only just beginning. We tried everything to talk her down. I told her to drop the knife, to stop hurting herself, that we could help her. But she was completely fixated, staring right through me, muttering under her breath. Her words made no sense. A stream of twisted phrases that blurred together. It was like I wasn't even there, like nothing was real to her, except whatever nightmare she was living in. And then, in a split second, she moved. A low growl escaped her lips as she lunged off the bed, the knife raised high above her head. I barely had time to react. Everything happened in slow motion, the knife gleaming in the dim light, her bloodied face contorted in rage, and the primal, animalistic sound she made as she came at me. Instinct took over. My finger tightened on the trigger, and I fired twice. The shots echoed through the room, deafening, and she dropped to the floor. Both bullets hit her arm, and she screamed. A blood-curdling wail that pierced through me. She clutched her wounded arm, writhing on the floor, sobbing and laughing at the same time. The knife slipped from her grip, clattering against the hardwood. We moved fast, cuffing her as gently as we could, trying to stop the bleeding from her wrist and the gunshot wounds. I called for an ambulance, my hands shaking. She kept whispering that same phrase, "I need blood. I need blood,"
over and over until her voice faded into nothing. The paramedics took her to the hospital, and she was later transferred to a psychiatric facility. I found out she was declared not guilty by reason of insanity and would remain in that facility indefinitely. But no verdict or diagnosis could erase what she'd done. The homeowners who watched her madness unfold through their doorbell cameras, the couple who came so close to tragedy in their own home, and me, standing face to face with her unhinged violence, it left scars on all of us. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still in that room, with her sitting on the blood-soaked bed, staring at me, smiling that twisted smile. I still hear her cackle sometimes, echoing in my mind like it's never going to leave. That night wasn't just a bad call. It was the kind of nightmare that lingers long after the shift ends.